You unzip the tent at dawn, and a child's toy is staring back at you from a wet rock. It shouldn't be there. There are no tracks leading to it, nothing else disturbed, just the toy, propped upright, eyes bright with mud. Before we go any further, the words Wendigo and Skinwalker come from indigenous North American traditions that are rich and diverse. In this video, we'll be using those names as ways people have described certain behaviors, mimicry, baiting, relentless stalking, not as proof of anything supernatural. These accounts are reported experiences. They are being told as they were told to me. Story 1. The Toy on the Rock. We'd picked a spot off an unmarked spur trail in the state forest. 2 days of cold weather hiking, a creek that still hummed under a thin sheet of ice, and a clearing the size of a trailer where we set the tent. My friend Dennis and I had been hiking since first light. We were tired in that competent way that makes you clumsy but still careful. I remember the small things, the orange of my sleeping bag, the way the river smelled like iron and wet pine, the pack of freeze-dried lasagna we'd shared, the tiny stove I tucked away before crawling into the tent. It was just before sunrise. Dennis had been in the vestibule rearranging gear. I was last to bed. I zipped the tent up, somehow certain of the world outside, because he was there and the fire had been banked and the creek was close. I slept like you sleep when you're exhausted and cold, deep, ragged, unaware. When I opened the tent in the morning, there was a soft sound of fabric and canvas, and then the sight of a small, dirty blue stuffed bear sitting upright on a smooth rock about 5 feet from the tent door. Its fur was matted, one button eye missing, the other looking like a dull moon. The bear was facing straight at us. I remember the sound of the zipper, the way you remember a gunshot in a film, sudden and cruel. My heart hit the inside of my ribs so hard it felt like it might leave bruises. "Did you put that there?" I asked, voice small. Dennis said nothing. He sat up slow and looked at the bear and then past it at the trees that hems the clearing. There were no hoof prints, no boot marks, no drag lines in the thin frost. The ground around the rock was clean. The bank of the creek had a fragile crust of ice that rippled where the water moved. Nothing disturbed in it. We looked at each other like fools who'd been caught in a prank. We flipped the bear over. There was a small smear of something dark on the seam where the stuffing met the fabric. Dirty, old. Not fresh blood, not that I could see, but stained and faint. The bear smelled faintly of smoke and pine sap, like something that had been out in rain and slept in a campfire. We tried to reason it away. Hikers come through here. Maybe a parent dropped a toy. Maybe kids had been using this clearing. But the trail had seen no footprints in days. The route we took is off the map.
You don't just find a stuffed toy perfectly centered in front of a tent on a rock in a clearing where no one else should be. We searched. We looked for tracks the way people look for their keys. There were no prints. We looked for signs of a campsite, a tarp, something. Nothing. I walked the perimeter, feeling stupid. The forest felt over-attentive, every branch a finger pointing at us. At one point, I believed I saw a movement way out past the trees, something impossibly thin and hunched, like someone looking at us without stepping into the light. When I blinked, it was gone. We debated calling it in. There was no signal. We debated leaving the toy. We debated staying. I remember the clatter of the pot we'd used to reheat the lasagna and the way Dennis' jaw worked when he tried to organize a plan and couldn't. At the end, we did the most basic human thing. We packed, fast. We left the stuffed bear where it sat, upright and deliberate. We didn't look back, but I could feel the forest burning with a tension on our shoulders as we shouldered packs and went down the trail. At one point, I turned and half expected to see a silhouette standing where the bear had watched us. There was nothing but the trees and the slick, gray sky. Days later, when we stopped for coffee in a gas station where the heat tasted like metal, Dennis swore he heard something moving in the underbrush when he opened the car. He hasn't camped out since. I haven't slept in a tent without at least 2 other people in the same zip code. We both wake to noise now. A branch, a dropped lid, a cough. My body reads them like a threat. What unsettled me more than the bear itself was the sense of intentionality. Someone, or something, placed that object where it knew someone would wake up to it. The arrangement felt meant to startle, to announce presence without showing itself. It used a human cue, a child's toy, and turned it into a message. This arrangement, the way something uses a human object to unsettle or lure, is a behavior people often point to when they talk about skinwalkers in modern folklore. Entities described as taking on human gestures, leaving human artifacts, or imitating human sounds to confuse and terrify. Again, this is how some accounts describe patterns. I am not saying the bear proves anything more than someone or something wanted us to know we were watched. If you love true chilling encounters, hit subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. Story 2. The Lure on the Snowy Road. I worked nights that winter at a warehouse 3 hours from home. My truck was an old Subaru Outback, reliable, predictable. It had a dent in the tailgate and a dog hair halo on the back seat. The storm came hard, fat flakes that turned roads into veils and made the trees look like they wore winter dresses. My radio hissed, and the highway sign had a pale notice about chain restrictions, but I was used to driving in the dark.
I like the solitude, the steady burn of headlights pushing into the dark. At about 2:30 a.m., I passed a culvert where the ditch was full of drifted snow. At first, I thought a pile of clothing had been jammed against the bank. Then, as I slowed, the shape moved. It sat up. My first thought was practical. Someone had hit a patch of ice and gone off the road. I pulled over. There was no cell signal, no surprise. This section of back road tends to eat bars like a bird eats seeds. I left the truck running. I closed the door, and the cold hit me like a slap. The smell of wet wool, of diesel and suspended metal was everywhere. The man, if it was a man, was curled in the snow, coat in tatters, face pale as old paper. He thrust a hand at me, and his voice was a thin, panicked thing. My leg, he said. Please, my leg is broke." I think any of us would have stopped, given the conditions. If you live in the country long enough, you carry the small, stubborn credo of helping. I moved closer, because that's what you do. Check, assess, call a tow, get someone safe. He said his name and where he'd been driving. He kept asking me to drive him to his vehicle. Only after I had my phone out, fumbling for service, did I notice the way the man moved. His face contorted, then smoothed, like someone learning to wear a smile. When I reached for a blanket in the back of my truck, 2 figures rose from just inside the tree line like they had been part of the snow itself. They were thin, and they didn't make noise when they moved. They wore dark coats and had gloves that were too tight. The first victim, if he was a victim at all, threw himself toward me as if he'd been possessed of a sudden strength. It was quick. My keys hit the pavement. One of them lunged at the passenger door, and his glove scraped the paint. I remember the scrape, the way you remember a knife's kiss, sharp and high. The man in the snow twisted, and in the motion I realized 2 impossible things. 1, the broken leg was a lie. His legs were fine. 2, his face had changed from pained to predatory in a blink, and it seemed wrong the way his mouth worked when he smiled, like he had neither the muscle memory nor the warmth to do it naturally. I shoved the door shut, but one of them had his foot wedged and his fingers where the latch lived. There was a tug and a sound like fabric, and then the impact of a body against the driver's door that made the truck rock. My hand went for the gear shift, and I threw it into reverse, not thinking. Tires through snow. I roared back onto the shoulder and didn't stop. I didn't even look in the rear view until I hit the road, and the Outback was spitting snow behind me. Out on the highway, I found a rest stop where the heater was a blessing and the fluorescent lights hummed like an altar. I called the state police, and they drove to the culvert. They took a statement.
The patrolman kept his voice low and professional, but he didn't try to say whether it was a gang attack or a staged abduction or something else. He told me they found a cluster of footprints leading from the tree line to the ditch and back, as if people had been circling. They found a length of rope with a frayed end, some stones arranged in a small pile, and a strip of cloth the color of old clothing. It all read like a plan. The officers said people will stage accidents to ambush drivers, wildly cruel schemes where multiple people create a wounded driver to lure someone out for robbery or worse. That was the human interpretation. But when I told a friend about the feeling I had, the way the victim shifted, the way his face didn't quite respond like a human's, that's when folks online started talking about mimicry. They pointed to stories where predators, human or otherwise, use a bait scenario. A wounded person meant to trigger empathy, a helpless voice meant to draw you in. Wendigo lore is often associated with extreme cold, isolation, and hunger-driven stalking. In modern retellings, some people use the name to describe attacks or behaviors where the predator appears in a pack and uses human cues to lure prey. Take that as a label, a metaphor. I told the police what I had seen. They told me what they found. The footprints were real. The rope was real. The rest, what my eyes did with the image of a man's face, might be the brain filling blanks when you're frightened on a snowbound road. Or it might be something else. After that night, I drove with the doors locked and the heat on high. I didn't stop for people on back roads again until I had cell service and a plan. It made me harder, a little colder. I remember seeing patrolling signs that said, "If you stop, call 911 before you get out," and thinking about how the default rule of helping could be weaponized. What felt like a predator stratagem, luring with a broken leg, had the same logic as baiting in other stories. Make the prey feel safe, then take advantage. Whatever they were, human criminals taking advantage of empathy, or something that mimicked a human to seduce trust, the event changed me. I don't trust a figure in a ditch at night the way I used to. Story 3. The slashed tire, the voice, the blink. My name is Sarah, and I lived for a while in a stretch of cabins on the edge of a national forest where the highway narrows to 2 lanes, and the mail runs once a day. I worked mornings at a bakery in the nearest town, which meant leaving home in the dark and coming back late. The neighbors were friendly in that clipped, outdoor way. Wave, nod, borrow a cup of sugar, say hello on the porch. A week before the incident, a man from a neighboring property, someone I'd only ever waved to, stopped me on my way out and said, "You should be careful leaving at that hour." He sounded like a neighbor. He sounded like the kind of man who notices other people's patterns. A week before the incident, a man from a neighboring property, someone I'd only ever waved to, stopped me on my way out and said, "You should be careful leaving at that hour." He sounded like a neighbor. He sounded like the kind of man who notices other people's patterns.
He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He said in a tone that was too casual, "You don't want strangers hanging around your place at night." I didn't take it seriously. People say weird things sometimes. The night it happened, the moon was a pale coin. I drove a 2012 Honda Civic, small, reliable, and when I came home, the long gravel drive had that pearly look from the moonlight. I parked under a maple and walked the short shoveled path to my porch, thinking about dough and yeast and the way bread needs patience. When I got in the car to leave for work the next morning, there was a soft hiss. My tire had been slashed. I don't know if I called it slow or if I just recognized the sound. I had AAA card in my wallet. I was shaken. Who would do that? Then another car pulled into the drive. It was a truck I knew, one of the neighbors, and I breathed a sigh of relief, because when you're exhaling adrenaline, a familiar vehicle is a salve. A man stepped out and called my name from across the yard in a tone that used my nickname, the one only the people who'd known me for a while used. "Sarah," he called, "you all right?" He sounded like neighborly concern. He sounded like that man who'd warned me a week ago. His voice rolled across the yard, and for a second, everything was ordinary. Then something about the call struck wrong. It wasn't that the words were incorrect. It was that the man didn't blink. I know how strange that sounds. Bodies blink. Eyes burn and moisten. People who look at you in the dark blink when the sun hits them. He didn't. I found myself watching for that blink, and when it didn't come, the way my mind watches an unlatched door, something in me tightened. He moved in a way that felt rehearsed. When he came close, he insisted on helping change the tire, insisting he could handle it faster. The truck's tailgate hit the earth in a slow thunk. He kept talking the way people do when they try to distract you. He used my neighbor's name, the one who'd warned me last week. It was a script built on common fabrics. When he bent to take the spare from my trunk, his hand brushed mine, and it was too cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from metal or winter, but a dry, oddly artificial chill, like stepping into a shade that wasn't there a second before. My spine crawled. I stepped back. That's when I saw, from the corner of my eye, another figure by the passenger door. I heard a rustle of canvas. The man looked up, and his mouth shaped an apology without moving the rest of his face. "Sorry," he mouthed. He didn't blink. He didn't make all the small human adjustments a person does. I remember thinking that if I didn't move, I would be taken. There's a curious calculus in terror, how quickly you measure space and time and chance. I slammed my car door, went around the back of my vehicle, and the next second I was running toward the porch, with them close enough that the gravel burst outward behind me. One of them lunged, and something like a gloved hand, tight and mechanical, caught the sleeve of my jacket. I kept moving. I made it up the porch steps and into the house with a lock that felt thin and safe. I called 911. The dispatcher was calm. They arrived quickly, faster than I expected for that area. The officers took statements and looked for signs of forced entry or evidence. They found a knife with a dull edge in a discarded paper bag near the driveway. They also found a length of thin wire, a size of something that could be used to bind. Nothing explicit suggested anything ritualistic. Most of it read like someone had planned an abduction and wanted to make it look like a neighborly offer. The man who'd warned me earlier, he was gone. No one could find a matching description in the area. The truck people identified was not legally tied to any of the neighbors. It was as if the familiar had been folded into unfamiliar and then folded back into something no one could find. Weeks later, when friends came over, I noticed the small interrupting details in people's faces again. A person who didn't blink seemed odd. A tone that didn't waver felt rehearsed. My bed sits on the far side of the house now. I keep my porch light on. I check the locks 3 times the night after. I still startle when someone calls my name across a yard. Folklore and the thin line. Across these 3 experiences, you can find a pattern. The use of human cues to approach and disarm. An innocent toy, a wounded body, a familiar voice. People who collect these kinds of stories note that as a common thread in accounts labeled skinwalker-like or wendigo-like. Skinwalker stories often focus on imitation, taking on voices, gestures, appearances to get close. Wendigo lore is traditionally related to insatiable hunger and the brutal cold of winter, sometimes framed in modern retellings as relentless pack hunting or baiting. These terms are modern shortcuts people use to map a set of behaviors onto older stories. That mapping can be useful for making sense of frightening things we've seen, but it's important to be respectful. Wendigo and skinwalker are words from indigenous traditions, and those traditions are not interchangeable. They are not catch-all labels for anything strange in the woods. Always approach these names with acknowledgement of their origin and the communities from which they come. What I want you to take away is not that these names have proven anything. Take away instead the elements: isolation, a staged human cue, and a predator, human, otherwise, or some mix, that uses empathy against you. Those are the practical, terrifying lessons. Aftermath and the quiet damage. All 3 witnesses, Dennis and me at the tent, the driver on the snowy road, Sarah at the cabin, carry a similar residue. It's not only fear. It's the way ordinary life rearranges itself around the possibility of threat. Dennis won't sleep in a tent under canvas alone. The driver now plans his route in advance, refuses to stop without cell service, and hesitates any time he sees a figure at night. Sarah lives with more lights on and fewer assumptions about neighbors. They all report an increase in anxiety around the very things that used to feel safe: roads, warm hands, the notion that a neighbor's voice means help. There is a quiet grief there,
the loss of simple trust. A word on evidence. In 2 of the events, police found rope, footprints, and other items. In one case, the physical footprint evidence suggested human activity. That does not, in itself, explain the strangeness people later described. The facial oddity, the lack of blink, the sense of being mimicked. Memory warps when the body interprets danger. Sight can misread. Temperature can get strained into meaning. But even if the explanation is entirely human criminality, the method matters. Using familiar cues to lure people is a cruelty that feeds on compassion. Safety note. If you ever find someone on the roadside in a remote area, consider safety first. Call 911 and provide your exact location. If you stop, keep the car in park, the doors locked, and ask the person to stay where they are until help arrives. If it feels off, err on the side of caution. Do not become a hero in the dark when you have no backup. These are practical choices, not moral failings. Final thoughts. These stories sit in a place where folklore and real-world danger overlap. Whether what watched Dennis and me from the trees was a person, a prank, or something people later labeled a skinwalker, the effect was the same: a violation of the space where we thought we were safe. Whether the ditch man was a band of criminals or a modern echo of Wendigo-like pack hunting, someone designed a trap using a common human instinct, compassion, to catch another human. I hope you heard the urgency here. The woods and the winter are amplifiers. Isolation leaves you vulnerable. Human cruelty can look a lot like folklore, and folklore can look a lot like human cruelty. Respect the cultures that originated these names. Respect the people who tell you their experiences. And respect the simple rules of staying safe. If you've had an experience, something strange on a back road, a toy placed where it shouldn't be, a voice that sounded familiar but moved wrong, share it below. If this video made the back of your neck chill, like it did for me, hit like, subscribe, and tell someone you trust where you're headed when you go out. And if you live or travel in remote areas, keep your phone charged and your plans known to someone else.